So for our third presentation, we're looking at Islamic anti-Semitism. This is such an important topic, and unfortunately it's one that is associated with a lot of denial and misdirection. I will be surprised if the Royal Commission concludes that Islam is the problem, but it'll be interesting to see. Anti-Semitism, just before I speak about anti-Semitism, I wanted to say one thing about do we worship the same God? Islam teaches we do worship the same God. So Muslims will say to you, you and I, we worship the same God, because the Quran tells them to say that. The personalities and attributes of God in the Bible and the Quran are very different. So although they claim to live at the same address, the creator of the world, they have very different attributes. So I'd say if you were to press me, that we do, Christians and Muslims do in a sense worship a different God. But I think when Muslims pray to God, they're praying to who they believe the creator to be, and it's not obvious that God doesn't hear that. He could be responding to their faith, even if they misunderstand the nature of God. So it's not usually practically helpful when you're talking to Muslims to make an issue out of this. It's better to be able to talk about God and have the freedom to do that without fighting that. But yes, the Bible and the Quran have a very different understanding of God. So on to Islamic anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has multiple sources or drivers in Australia. There's Christian anti-Semitism, which is grounded in two principles. One is that Christianity supersedes Judaism and replaces Judaism, replacement theology. And the other is the claim that the Jews killed Jesus, so Jews are Christ's killers. So that's two ideas that have influenced Christian anti-Semitism, which is a real thing. I've often met Christians who have a replacement theology. Their worldview is that God's promises to the Jews have been superseded, that the church is the inheritor of all those promises. I don't think that's what the Bible says. It doesn't make sense, actually. Then there's right-wing racism and left-wing anti-Semitism, which is tied up with the idea of colonialization, that Israel is a colonial entity and Jews are treated with hostility because they're linked in people's minds with Israel. And then there's Islamic anti-Semitism. And all of these are important, but I think the most powerful game changer, which has determined the deterioration in anti-Semitism in Australia today, that it's gotten worse, the main ideological driver of that is Islamic anti-Semitism. This is not a new thing amongst Australian Muslims. So in 2002, I downloaded an article from an Islamic group's website in Melbourne, and the article was called "They Will Not Be Given Victory Over Us." And when I read the article, actually, I referred it to B'nai B'rith, which is an organisation that is attending to issues of anti-Semitism, a Jewish organisation. They referred it to the police at the time, but the article said things like the Jews have always opposed Islam, they tried to kill Muhammad, so they deserve God's curse, they're condemned to hell, God will oppose the Jews until Judgment Day. That's in the Quran. The Jews deserve God's judgment, that they would be exiled, unsettled and scattered all over the earth. They cause harm throughout the world by lies and political machinations. There'll always be people of hatred and enmity to Muslims. War against the Jews and their allies is a worldwide struggle, and it will continue till Judgment Day. The Jews desire life more than other people do, and this makes them unwilling to make sacrifices in defense of themselves. Jews will not fight like other people will, so there'll be a pushover. And arguments of these, it says in the article, should be pursued by Muslims by all possible means: talks, sermons, lessons, poetry, stories, charity, dinners and events, demonstrations, marches, the media, television broadcasts, and the internet. So that was a quarter of a century ago. This is not a new thing. It's not just happened in the last 3 years or 5 years. What does the Quran say? What do the sources of Islam say? Well, the Quran refers to Christians and Jews collectively as the people of the book. In the Quran, the people of the book attract a range of commentary, both some positive but a lot negative. And early on, at least, some Jews were counted as true believers. But the Quran's final judgments are very negative. For example, Surah 2, whoever desires a religion other than Islam, this is Surah 3, whoever desires a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from him. Or fight them until there's no more persecution, that is, no more rejection of Islam. And the religion is Allah's. So the one religion that will remain is Islam. Or Surah 9, he sent his messenger with guidance in the religion of truth so that he may cause it to triumph over every religion. And Surah 7 says Allah will cause people to inflict evil punishment on Jews until Judgment Day. Now, there are Jews mentioned in the Sunnah, the example and teaching of Muhammad, and in his biography. Most famously, the 3 Jewish tribes in Medina. So when Muslims migrated from Mecca, they fled to Medina, and they got a lot of support from the Medinans. They were living alongside 3 Jewish tribes. Muhammad expected that the Jews would recognize him as a prophet, but they rejected his overtures, his approaches. And his biography reports that the Jews used to annoy him with questions. In response, he accused them with trying to extinguish Islam with their questions. And when they didn't follow him, his attitude turned hostile to them. He called the Jews he was speaking to the men who asked questions, and that was a very bad thing apparently. Muhammad began to call for attacks on individual Jews, particularly those who'd opposed him, and he said to his followers, "Kill any Jew that falls into your power." At the same time, he told the Medinan Jews that they would be safe if they converted to Islam. Accept Islam and you'll be safe. Aslim taslam. Then Muhammad expelled one after the other 2 Jewish tribes from Medina, and the last one he wiped out, the Qurayza tribe. He beheaded the men and enslaved the women and children. It's recorded in a hadith that they inspected the boys, and if they were growing pubic hairs, they were beheaded, and if they weren't, they were enslaved. When the Muslims, and later, a number of these Jews fled to the oasis of Khaybar, and Muhammad took his armies to attack Khaybar. When the Muslims were about to attack the oasis, Muhammad's cousin Ali asked, "On what issue should we fight with these people? Why are we fighting, Muhammad?" And Muhammad said, "Fight them until they bear testimony to the fact that there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger." That is, fight them until they become Muslims. And when they do that, their blood and their property will be protected. You shouldn't kill them or loot them if they haven't become Muslims. Muhammad defeated the Jews of Khaybar, and the ones that continued to be living after that, he extracted tribute from them, 50% of their harvests, which became a foundation for the dhimma system and the treatment of non-Muslims in Islamic law. In his campaigns against the Jews, Muhammad took 2 leading Jewish women for himself after killing their husbands. Rayhana from Medina became Muhammad's concubine. She refused to convert to Islam at first, and so she didn't marry Muhammad. She refused to marry him. By some accounts, she later did convert to Islam, and Muhammad married her. Safiya from Khaybar, Muhammad took as his wife as well. Her father had been killed in the battle for Khaybar, and her husband had been tortured by lighting a fire on his chest and was then beheaded. Safiya was brought to Muhammad's marriage night tent past the decapitated, burnt body of her husband. One of his followers spent the night marching around his marriage tent, and in the morning Muhammad said, "What were you doing?" His friend said, "Well, you killed her husband, you killed her father, you killed her relatives, and I was just keeping you safe, so that's why I was wandering around the tent." And Muhammad said, "Oh, okay." Another of the captured Khaybar Jewish women, Zainab, reportedly prepared poisoned meat to kill Muhammad. He survived, but by some accounts it was Zainab's poison that eventually caused his death. In some hadiths, the Jews of Khaybar confessed that they'd all plotted together to kill him. They were collectively responsible for trying to assassinate Muhammad. Some say Muhammad died a martyr because of the poisoning, and some Muslims to this day blame the Jews for killing or attempting to kill Muhammad. Muhammad commanded this, as reported in different traditions: I will expel the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula and will not leave any but Muslims. And also, two religions shall not exist in the Arabian Peninsula, that is, just Islam. And expel the associators, the mushrikun, from the Arabian Peninsula, which is all non-Muslims. So this command of cleansing Arabia, except for Yemen, which Jews continued in Yemen, there's still Jews in Yemen today, a few left. This command of Muhammad was implemented under the second Caliph Umar. There's also there are a number of hadiths that are sort of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, and one is this famous one: Judgment Day won't come until Muslims fight the Jews. The Jews will hide behind the stones and the trees, and the stones and the trees will say, "O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." Except for the Kharakad tree, which is one of the trees of the Jews. That Jewish tree won't be crying out like that. There's also many references to Jews, negative references in the Quran. Al-Fatiha, which is a prayer at the start of the Quran, is quite a short chapter. It's included in the daily prayers of Muslims, I think 17 times a day. It says, guide us to the straight path, the path of those whom you've blessed, not the path of those on whom your anger falls. Muhammad said that's the Jews, nor those who go astray, that's the Christians. So every Muslim who prays 5 times a day, 17 times a day prays not to be a Jew who's under the wrath of God. The Quran says that Jews are the greatest enemies to Muslims. You'll find that the most violent of people in enmity, that is hatred to believers, are Jews and idolaters. The closest in affection are the Christians, so better disposed towards Christians than to Jews. Jews are cursed, and only a few are genuine believers. So some of those who are Jews alter words from their positions, and they say, we hear and disobey, and hear and do not hear, and observe us. They twist their tongues, they vilify Islam. God has cursed them for their disbelief, and so they don't believe except for a few. The Jews are said to be killers of the prophets, many references. Humiliation and poverty were stamped upon them, and they incurred the anger of God. That was because they disbelieved in the signs of God, or they killed the prophets without right. That was because they disobeyed and went on transgressing. There's Surah 2. And also in Surah 2 it says that Jews are treacherous covenant breakers. For their breaking their covenant we cursed them and made their hearts hard. You'll continue to see treachery from them, except for a very few, but pardon and excuse them. This is sort of earlier surahs suggesting better relations with them. Jews bring corruptions on the earth. Surah 2, Jews have knowingly concealed the truth, a number of references. Both David and Jesus, as prophets of Islam, cursed the Jews, unbelieving Jews. Jews will only love a Muslim if he converts to Judaism. In the past, Allah changed Jews into pigs and apes for their sins. Jews are also described as cursed warmongers. The Jews say the hand of God is chained. May they be cursed for what they say. Both his hands are outstretched, and so on. What has been sent down to you, that is the message of Islam, the guidance that Muhammad has received, has increased the Jews in insolent transgression and disbelief. So they've reacted negatively against Islam. And God says that we've cast enmity and hatred into them until the day of resurrection. And wherever they light the fire of war, God extinguishes it. But they keep on causing corruption on the earth, and God doesn't love people who do that. Jews are idolaters for saying that Allah has a son. I think that'd be news to many Jews. That's what they think. Muslims should not be friends with Jews. The Jews claim they killed their Messiah. Jews love this life and don't care about the next life. You will find, God knows the evildoers, indeed you'll find among them the most desirous of people for life, even more than the idolaters. This is a teaching that the Jews will not fight because they love life too much. They're not willing to give their lives. So therefore Muslims will win if they fight against the Jews. So these three charges, that Jews are warmongering, treacherous, and love life, undermine prospects of peace. Because why would you enter into a peace agreement with someone who's treacherous, who is always starting wars, and doesn't have the courage to fight? Obviously you should fight them because the peace is going to be fruitless and you're going to win in the end. There's also a principle of collective guilt and punishment which strongly influences how Muslims think about the Jews. Not all Muslims, but it does influence many. This is infused in the Quran and the Sunnah in the treatment of non-Muslims. For example, the way in which Muhammad drove out 2 whole Jewish tribes and destroyed the 3rd tribe, this establishes a principle in Islamic law that if only some members of a community break their covenant with Muslims, then the whole community can be punished. Collective punishment. So Said Ramadan al-Bouti was a Syrian Sunni Muslim scholar, actually quite brilliant, and I really love his jurisprudence of the prophetic biography, not because I like the ideas that he's presenting, but because of the clarity and the brilliance of his thought. And it's a very interesting text. But he said, the messenger of God, Muhammad, put to death all of the Banu Qurayza's fighting men without asking each one individually whether he'd violated the covenant between them and Muslims. Similarly, in the case of Banu al-Nadir, this is the other tribe, he evicted all of them due to their betrayal of the covenant which has existed between them and the Muslims, despite the fact that the betrayal had been initiated by only a few individuals. What is he saying here? He's saying we have examples from the life of Muhammad where a few Jews did the wrong thing and the whole community was punished. So he's saying this establishes a foundation in Islamic law, in jurisprudence, that you can punish a whole group because of the sins of a few. It's the idea of collective punishment is foundational in, it's regarded as one of the foundations of Islamic law. This is totally opposed to the principle that everyone is accountable individually before the law for what they've done right or wrong, which is part of our tradition. Everyone's equal before the law. So some of the sources for all this material that I've shared with you is the life of Muhammad, the biography of Muhammad. There's my book, The Third Choice. I go into these issues too. A book by Andrew Boston called The Legacy of Islamic Antisemitism. There's also another book edited by him, which is the PhD thesis of Sheikh Tantawi, who was the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University. And Andrew Boston has called this a modern Quranic Kampf against the Jews. It's a huge book, actually. And Al-Yahud, Islamic Enmity and the Jews by Sam Solomon and Elias Al-Makdisi. They argue, particularly about the issue with Israel, that enmity against the Jews is a fundamental driver of the conflict. It, in a way, logically precedes the concept of having grievances. The enmity drives the grievances, not the other way around. I'll say more about that, hopefully, in a bit. Now, this is a really interesting point. Some experts have denied the reality of theological Islamic anti-Semitism. So these are clever, well-educated experts who deny that Islam is theologically anti-Semitic, despite all the material that I have gone over with you from the fundamental sources. So Bernard Lewis is a brilliant writer and scholar, fluent in Arabic and Turkish and perhaps Persian too, a huge achiever. He's a Jew himself. He said, in Islamic society, hostility to the Jew is non-theological. It's not related to any specific Islamic doctrine, nor to any specific circumstance in Islam's sacred history. For Muslims, it's not part of the birth pangs of their religion, as it is for Christians. It's really amazing, you know. He drove out 2 Jewish tribes and beheaded the other and took 2 women as as his wives, and the Quran is littered with anti-Jewish verses, including claims that they're cursed until the end of time, and that God will send people to destroy them until the end of time, and all these libels, and it's not part of the birth pangs of Islam, and it's not theological. So it's actually quite extraordinary how people can have a blind spot. It's like the truth is so clear, but it can't be owned, it can't be acknowledged. What are the consequences of acknowledging this? And Bernard Lewis said, Islam's not anti-Semitism because it's not Christianity. He said, basically, that Christianity is anti-Semitic, but not Islam. Islam's very different. Another example is these group of scholars who wrote an important article on the Palestinian view of Israel back in the 60s. And they said this: except for the persecutions in the Hejaz, that is in the life of Muhammad, the Arabic world of the Near East has never known anti-Semitism. It's amazing. Since the 7th century, the whole of the Muslim world in the Middle East has never known anti-Semitism. It's extraordinary because there is document after document and statement after statement after statement that say quite the opposite, and including the Quran and all the commentaries on the Quran. It's extraordinary that apparently clever Christians and these, including some Palestinian pastors, would say such things. So the reason why I'm saying this to you is not to debunk these people or say they are incompetent or liars or anything like that. I'm just bringing before you the fact that the testimony of people who are experts on this topic is often corrupted, inaccurate, and confusing. And so you need to be vigilant and thoughtful and careful in how you respond to the claims that people make. Similarly, people will claim that Christians had it really well under Islamic rule, that it was good for them. Of course, the Zionist system led to the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocide, in which a couple of million people were killed. But people will still believe that this system was good and righteous. I mean, my mind boggles about how people end up saying things like this when the evidence is so overwhelmingly the opposite to what they're claiming. Another example, there was an Iranian Jewish guy, now I think living in America or Europe, who brought an incredible collection of Islamic art to Australia about 20 years ago. And he was asked on the ABC, I think Rachel Cohn asked him, whether his work to present Islamic art might help Muslims understand that Jews are not inferior. And he said, there's no question of the Jews being inferior. That has never crossed any Muslim's mind. Virtually 1/3 of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, the second surah, is in praise of the two other religions. Well, I've showed you all those verses from Surah 2 already. You can see what sort of praise they give towards the Jews. And anyway, Al-Baqarah is not 1/3, it's 7% of the Quran. And he says, I don't think this anti-Semitism is even a question at all. I think the problem is ignorance among people. Well, it is ignorance, sir, but the ignorance is all yours. And how misleading is that? When it's an Iranian Jewish guy who spent a lifetime and millions of dollars collecting Islamic art in order to show positive relationships between religions. If you hear him testifying like this, why wouldn't you believe him? Why wouldn't you say, yeah, that must be true. He obviously knows what he's talking about. But actually, he's factually inaccurate on multiple levels, and it's quite the opposite to what he says. How can this be? Why is this happening? It's important to wrestle with that question. In a recent Australian anti-discrimination case, which is Wertheim versus Haddad, this was a case of a Muslim preacher who'd given a series of sermons on Muhammad's dealings with the Jews. And he was taken to the anti-discrimination tribunal, saying he was guilty of discriminating and vilifying Jews. Now the judge, Justice Stewart, concluded, he said, the experts agree, the experts he'd heard in the testimony, that neither the Quran nor the Hadith teach that Jews have any inherent negative qualities as a people, but rather that the criticism in these texts is against the Jews in one particular historical context, being Muhammad's community in 7th century Medina. Interestingly, Judge Higgins in the Catch the Fire case made similar comments about Islam 20 years ago. So now the judge came to this conclusion that Islam was not anti-Semitic, basically, based on two experts' testimony. One is a Christian expert, Gabriel Reynolds, who cited two eminent conservative Muslim scholars, Sheikh At-Tayyib and Sheikh Al-Qaradawi, who'd made certain positive-sounding comments about the Jews. So he used these, Gabriel Reynolds used these, to argue that, that Islam is not anti-Semitic. However, these two sheikhs that Gabriel Reynolds quoted have made many negative statements about the Jews, and let's have a look at a few of them. For example, At-Tayyib was reported by Gabriel Reynolds to have said, Islam does not see non-Muslims, Christians and Jews from the perspective of enmity, tension or violence, but from the perspective of human brotherhood and kindness. This was a speech he gave to the House of Lords in England. But on Egyptian television, he said, one verse in the Quran explains Muslims' relationship with Jews. This is an historical perspective which has not changed to this day. See how we suffer today from global Zionism and Judaism. Since the inception of Islam 1400 years ago, we have been suffering from Jewish and Zionist interference in Muslim affairs. This is a cause of great distress for the Muslims. The Quran said it, and history has proven it. You shall find the strongest in enmity to the Jews, to the Muslims, to be the Jews. So why did Gabriel Reynolds choose the first quote and not the second quote when he was presenting this issue to the judge? What about Al-Qaradawi, the other person that Gabriel Reynolds quoted? He quoted Al-Qaradawi as saying, it's essential for everyone to recognize that I do not harbor hatred towards Jews based solely on their Jewish identity, as Judaism is not the cause of the conflict between us and Israel. Jews, as followers of a heavenly religion, remain close to us. Now, Al-Qaradawi has made other statements. For example, he said, the Quran does not devote as much space to the Persians and the Romans as it does to the Jews, whose crimes and depraved deeds it exposes. They are the greatest of liars when they speak, the greatest of villains when they quarrel, and the most treacherous people when they make pacts. Throughout history, Allah has imposed upon the Jews people who would punish them for their corruption. That's a Quranic verse. The last punishment was carried out by Hitler. Hitler was a fulfillment of the prophecy in the Quran that the Jews would be punished. This was divine punishment for them. Allah willing, the next time will be at the hands of the believers. So he's saying, we are waiting for another Holocaust. Why did Gabriel Reynolds quote Al-Qaradawi saying these nice things about the Jews, but ignored these other statements of Al-Qaradawi? Al-Qaradawi has explained that the reason deals so much with the Jews is to know how to deal with them in the present. This passage was actually from the very same article which Reynolds drew the positive quote towards the Jews. He ignored other quotes in the same article when he was presenting this to the judge. Allah knows that there'll be future conflicts between us and them. It's crucial for us to understand them accurately based on reality, not imagination. So what Al-Qaradawi is saying is all that negative stuff in the Quran and the Hadiths about Jews, we have to study it in order to know what Jews are like today, because we should have the same attitudes to them that the Quran teaches. So why would an expert on the Quran, one of the top scholars of Islam and of the Quran in the world today, be presenting evidence of like that to a judge? I wrote to him. We've had correspondence. He's a great scholar. He's a brilliant scholar. He's an excellent scholar. But he's made these completely false statements. And he said, this is a very complicated and sensitive issue. I mean, you need to understand that Islam attracts to itself these sorts of confusions in clever people. My explanation is it's a spiritual issue. It's a spiritual power that's being activated, and people are damaged by it and influenced in ways that are contrary to reason, contrary to reality. There are countless statements today made by leading present-day Muslims which agree with the hostile quotes about the Jews from At-Tayyib and Al-Qaradawi, which themselves follow the Quran very closely. Such utterances from eminent Muslims and not so eminent ones are everywhere to be found. I think over the last 20 years, almost every week I've had an email reporting yet another statement against the Jews by Muslims. It would be bizarre if Muslims didn't look to the Quran and Sunnah to understand Jews and Christians and how to relate to them. This problem of misdirection and confusion applies to Islam in general, not just about anti-Semitism, but about jihad and about the dhimma and about the history of Islam, whether Islam is tolerant, whether Islam is peaceful. Now, it's one thing for academics to take part in this denial, and you could analyse why they do that. You can explain the advantages to being a Quranic scholar who speaks well of Islam, the political advantages, the economic advantages perhaps. But it's another thing that the security services believe these things. Because if the security services have a corrupted and inaccurate understanding of the truth, how will they be able to counter the forces that are creating the problems we're facing? If our politicians are part of the denial, how will the government introduce policies that will work? Why does this happen? Well, there's lots of reasons. It's quite complex, actually. Sometimes people don't want to give credibility to radical elements. Like if I say Islam really teaches that, it could encourage Muslims to be radical. I've heard that argument. There's a desire to stigmatize bad actors and bad faith Muslims. That's what the judge came out to say against Haddad. Haddad's a bad Muslim because he says that Islam incites anti-Semitism. So he's not even a good Muslim. There's a desire to guide Muslims to less destructive interpretations of the Quran. From an Islamic perspective, everything you do is guidance. So what you should say is what you think Muslims should do and believe. So that means you're not just quoting accurately what Islam teaches, you're saying what you think Muslims should hear. This is why the Quranic translations done by Muslims are often not completely accurate, because what they do is they translate what the commentaries say the text means. That is, they translate the guidance that they think people need to receive, not the actual text of the Arabic. Sometimes people say, oh, it can't be translated because it's so holy and it's so special. No, that's not the reason, I think. People say that translations are just interpretations because actually Muslims are reporting interpretations. They're not actually just translating the text, because it's all about guidance. There's a fear of being accused of racism for exposing these things. There's the desire not to strain collegial relationships with Muslims, with people in the academy who review your research grants and with whom you have partnerships and whom you have conferences with. How are you going to manage those relationships if you're critical of Islam? There's financial rewards. Qatar has given billions of dollars to North American universities. Why have they done that? Because they're buying influence. There's relying often on the opinions of their personal Muslim contacts rather than original sources. I was once speaking about Islam, and I was speaking about female genital mutilation, and a very long-term missionary who'd served in Pakistan said to me, oh no, that's not part of Islam. And I said, well, why do you say that? And he said, a Muslim told me that. I said, well, here are the verses, and here's the teachings and the examples and the textbooks from Sharia law. This is where it says female genital mutilation is part of Islam. And he said, I didn't know that, he said. There's a determination to think well of Muslims in general. If I could think well of all the Muslims in the world, that would be such a relief. I wouldn't have to worry about terrorism or Islamization. I just think well of Muslims and everything will be fine. I'll leave the problem to my grandchildren to deal with. To call radical Islam mainstream raises very troubling implications, ideological adjustments. It sort of puts you in a position of being forced to do something about it. Selectively paying attention to certain texts helps avoid cognitive dissonance. You've got conflicts in the reality of what you're seeing and what is in the world, and so you push certain things out of the way so you don't have cognitive dissonance, the problem of inconsistency in your world. And then there's the spiritual power of Islam to form and transform people's worldviews of both Muslims and non-Muslims. I think the spiritual underpinning of these apologetic spaces is really important to understand. This is a spiritual issue, not just an ideological issue. So some concluding remarks. I'm not going to attempt to tease out the implications of all these observations for how we view Israel and the Palestinian issues and grievances. I'm writing an article at the moment in a response to Kairos 2, which is a theological, a plea to the Western world to help dismantle Israel. So I'm interested in that issue, but I'm not trying to draw conclusions about that here. It's important for Christians to grasp that although the Quran is less hostile to Christians than to Jews, it's still hostile to Christians as well. The Sharia calls for the same fate for Jews and Christians. They are both to be subjugated under the Dhimma Pact and under Islamic rule. And there's a saying in Arabic, Saturday comes before Sunday. So we'll deal with the Jews first, and then the Christians' turn will come. Christians cannot escape by being anti-Jewish. That's not going to protect them in the end. Although that is a pressure that some Middle Eastern Christians experience. That's a whole interesting topic in itself. Islamic theology and law affords two roles to non-Muslims. And I'm speaking at a kind of deep psychological level. Either they're enemies of Muslims and objects of war, or they're subjugated dhimmis living under Islamic rule and accepting it, and destined to serve Islam. Islam pushes this choice upon non-Muslims. Are you going to be against us, or are you going to serve us? These are the two options that Islam offers non-Muslims. Safety is offered only to those who serve or who convert. In modern contexts, even when there's no dhimma or no jihad, even in those contexts, this choice of opposing or serving still shapes Muslim-Christian relationships, and it shapes the psychology of non-Muslims as well. To resist Islamization, the pressure to transform our world so that it would be conforming to the Sharia, we need to refuse this dichotomy. We need to refuse to be one of those two people, in a sense. We need to find a truer and more authentic way to be believers and followers of Jesus, and not just being forced into these roles by Islam. I'm going to stop there, and we've got a few minutes, I think. Let me have a look. Yeah, we've got 12 minutes for questions, so over to you. Yes.
I'm just thinking about the man that was from Iran, but he was also Jewish, that you were speaking about. And it made me think about this sort of denial happening in the world, that even that you're trying to deny that even the Holocaust happened.
Yes.
So there's even people like that. How would you answer someone like that if they spoke to you and said to you there wasn't a Holocaust? I know there
And
was.
said what?
And said there was no Holocaust.
Well, I'd just say, look, you believe that in spite of enormous and overwhelming evidence. So that's a fantasy. Just be as simple as that, really. Yeah. Here.
I'm interested to get your thoughts on how you view Malaysia in the context of what you've discussed. It's my understanding that Malaysia has two courts in the country. It's majority Muslim. And how does the Muslim world view Malaysia?
Well, Malaysia is a country in which Islam is dominant. If a Malay becomes a Christian, it's not accepted by the state. If a Muslim became a Christian, she couldn't marry a Christian man. That would be adultery because she's considered a Muslim, and her marriage would not be valid. Malaysia also extracts money from non-Muslims by requiring, when there's a company that's like a Chinese company, they have to employ Muslims at senior levels. Malaysia gives discriminatory scholarships to Malays to go to university, so Christians in Borneo, young Christians, they would convert to Islam in order to get access to the discriminatory funding. So it has its own particular kind of implementation of the Dhimma system, where Christians are hemmed around and sometimes assassinated, the pastors that have disappeared. and subject to inferior conditions and having to pay as well. And so that system which the British helped set up has been kind of developed and become more Islamicized as time has passed. So it's a good example of a country under the pressure of the global Islamic revival to re-implement Islam. It's very concerning. I don't like what's been happening in Malaysia. I think the Chinese Christians and other Christians, they're not always fully understanding what's happening. Like, they know it's not good, but they don't see it through the grid of Islamic law and the transformation that it's bringing to them as a nation. Yeah, I had a series of videos which are on YouTube on the Dhimma and living under Islam, and I remember a woman from Singapore who's from that environment. She's watching, she's just in tears, like, oh, I understand what's happening to us now. But yeah, it's really, really troubling. There should be international protest against the discrimination that's against people because of their faith. It's part of the Malaysian system, but we just accept it. Yeah, we just accept it. Question here.
Do you think it's an important issue to address Australian authorities about this, and that is a lot of Muslims are becoming authority figures because they have the quality, the people that elect them to be these authority figures.
Look, I think...
They have the qualifications.
Well,
Is that right?
Well, over time, Muslims will become more and more present in politics, in governance, in corporations, in education, and that I mean, you see that's happening in the US with the mayor of New York and the mayor of London being Muslims and pushing an Islamic agenda. We need to expect that this will happen, that Muslims will become more and more prominent in society. And there's pressure for that within the Muslim community, and it's natural and unsurprising that will happen in our country as well. Yes, here, Margot.
What's causing this sort of global resurgence in Islam? There seems to be some sort of
Okay.
revival or push towards Islam.
Yeah, so why is there a global revival, Islamic revival? So it's a theological response to a theological crisis. So up until about 1500, Islam was dominant really in all fronts. But then it began to lose. So the Portuguese conquered Goa in 1504, and you begin to see a number of Islamic states falling to European powers. And Napoleon conquered Egypt. The Russians were pushing the Turks back in their wars, the sort of Russo-Turkish wars over centuries. The Philippines was conquered, taken over by the Americans. You got the British who destroyed Islamic rule in India. The Portuguese helped the liberation of Christian Ethiopia from Islamic rule. The colonies in North Africa, etc., etc. So this was a shock to the Muslim world, and when they realized what was happening, it was a theological crisis, because Islam promises success, come to success. The Muslims should be successful ones, and their conquest of the Middle East was a proof of that. But then they're thrust into a situation where they're not successful. Not only are they not successful, but the Westerners are producing all the technology. As one Saudi guy said, don't bag the Westerners. If we didn't have them, we wouldn't have spectacles, we couldn't read. So they were losing technologically, they were losing politically, they were coming under pressure. They were under pressure to dismantle the Dhimma system and not to treat Christians in an inferior way. And it was very painful. So the question is why? So it's a theological crisis, and the solution is theological. The reason why this is happening is we are not following Islam strictly enough. And if we implement Sharia properly and we follow it faithfully, we will rule again. And so if you look at graduating class photos from Egypt in, say, 1970, the women will not be covered, most of them. But today, most of them are. So women are being covered up everywhere. Why? To make Islam great again, to be Sharia compliant, to be faithful. The resurrection of jihad, the return of the dhimma, the extraction of jizya from this tribute from Christians in North Africa. All these things are the result of this theological response to a theological crisis. So the first crisis of Islam is the West won. And the second crisis is that when Muslims actually rise up against this and take control, as happened in Algeria or ISIS or Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood, everything gets worse. So in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood said, Islam is the solution. Whatever the problem is, Islam is the solution. And then the Muslim Brotherhood took over, and it was a basket case. It was terrible. And when the army overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood, the people were elated. Look at what ISIS did. And so many Muslims have turned to Christ, fleeing from Iraq and Syria, because what ISIS did proved to them that Islam was not the answer. So we're in this time of kind of centuries-long process of the destruction of confidence in Islam, the attempt to revive, and each time when the revival has happened, it's been a mess. Iran is a mess. Iran was the kind of one of the first leaders of this revival, like re-implementing Islamic rule, overthrowing the ruler, and it's been a disaster. So 80% of Iranians hate Islam, and many Iranians blame Islam for all their problems. The Islamic government turned out to be corrupt and cruel and heartless. And so many Iranians say, if that's Islam, we want nothing to do with it. So what we're in at the moment is this time when Muslims all over the world are having very deep doubts about Islam. It used to be the case 50 years ago that it was kind of received knowledge that was very hard to convert Muslims or to have missionary work amongst Muslims. There's an exponential growth in movements to Christ amongst Islamic groups around the world. It's the most exciting time in history in terms of reaching out with the gospel to Muslims. But it's being driven by that very dynamic, this theological crisis. We are the successful ones. We have to do that by being more obedient, and then that plays out. Islam's faults become clearer. They're more obvious to people now. People can access the internet. They can get information for themselves. Islam's foundations are under enormous pressure. Question over here. Spiritual warfare. I have a little book, Liberty to the Captives. I might have a couple left on this issue. So there's a big issue. Islam has two covenants. It has a covenant for Muslims and a covenant for non-Muslims. And each comes with conditions and curses and spiritual bondage. So when someone leaves Islam, they renounce and break that covenant, which can bring consequences and kind of blowback for them. And when Christians stand against this call to submission, that causes problems as well. In addition to that, many Muslims practice kind of folk religion of some kind. There's a lot of occult practices, magic, belief in spirits, and strategies to deal with that. So if you're in an Islamic environment, you're like a missionary in an Islamic environment, you have to put up with curses against Christians in the mosques, and the impact that has spiritually upon you. And you've also got to deal with the environment in which, the spiritual environment in which you're living. So I think Islam has a powerful spiritual hold on people, and it influences them. You can be Islamized as a missionary, where your thinking becomes kind of aligned with Islamic priorities. I've seen a number of leading Christians who devoted themselves to academic work on Islam, who've been transformed not in a good way, in the way they've written and spoken about Islam. Bishop Kenneth Cragg argued that Christians owed a debt to Islam because of the way Islam, he believed, arose, that they were exposed to heretic Christians. And so because we failed Islam and Muhammad, we owe a debt towards Islam. But actually the Dhimma says that the Islamic rule for non-Muslims says that yes, they do owe a debt. They should pay every year, So you've got you see these transformations of the way people think that can be traced to the spiritual influence of Islam, which is quite powerful. And it's not good to send missionaries into Islam-rich environments without equipping them well for this. And one of the things I do is I teach a course on discipling Muslim background believers through deliverance, and we've taught 100 or so missionaries who are in service in this area. They're desperate for help because they feel the pressure quite intensely wherever they are. Here, thank you.
Mark, there's a book called Christ in the Rubble.
Yeah, I know of a Christian, this is a question about Christ in the rubble from a pastor in Bethlehem. I know about Christian Palestinians and their liberation theology and their use of that against Israel. It's too complicated for me to get into now, but basically I think some Christians adopt a kind of submitted, surrendered approach to Islam. Someone compared it to the battered wife syndrome, where someone who's being abused is praising their husband. So I think Christians can get caught in that space. There's a question up the back there. Yeah, so it's not too difficult. The Torah, which was the book given to Moses, and the Injil, which was the book from heaven given to Jesus, have been corrupted. And so the scriptures we have in our hands are but corrupted remnants of those Islamic texts. So the Gospels and the Torah is in the Bible. There's probably bits of it that are true, but there's a lot of it that's corrupt. So you can't rely on that for true information. If you want to know who Jesus was, read the Quran. That's just a worldview. No, Christianity and Judaism were corrupted before Muhammad, and Muhammad was sent to clear up all the corruption, so that true believers who sincerely seek after Jesus would become Muslims and honor the Jesus of the Quran, which is the true Jesus. But it does two things. It affirms the original text that was sent down from Allah, but not the ones in the hands of the believers. It doesn't affirm my Bible. It affirms a text which Jesus received from heaven. We don't even believe Jesus got a book from heaven. That's not what Christians believe. So, yeah, it's kind of, you have to get your head around it. It works differently. I mean, one of the apologetic responses to that is to show evidence that the Bible has not been corrupted. And when was it corrupted? How do they know it was corrupted? So that's a whole, apologetics with Islam's a whole topic in itself. There's a question over here. I think there's multiple reasons. So one reason why this is a question of why are Muslims coming to Christ? Is it the internet? So one reason is they're dissatisfied with Islam. They think Islam's the problem, not the solution. Another reason is they know a Christian, and the migration has opened up lots more opportunities for connections between Muslims and non-Muslims. Most Muslims in the world don't know a Christian, so that's a big change. There's the issue of the Holy Spirit reaching out to Muslims in dreams and visions and miracles and deliverances, and that's like an amazing thing that's happening in our time in a very intense way. We were involved with planting this Iranian church. So many miracles. I've seen a lot of miracles in my lifetime, never as many as when I was working with them. So God is doing something extraordinary. One of our parishioners came to me one time and said, "Why don't we see more miracles?" I said, "Come down on Wednesday night to Dandenong and pray for people and see what you see there." So there's that. There's the other is the democratization of information. People can find out about Muhammad for themselves in their own language just by clicking on the internet. So yeah, that's a factor. That is a factor. So there's various reasons why, but all these things are coming together. And I think no doubt the rejection of Islam, the loss of confidence in Islam is a profound driver of this. Whereas, 100 years ago, Muslims knew nothing else but what they'd been told. That was their world. They didn't have options, but now there are lots of options, and Islam is struggling to keep up with it. It's not easy for them. Let me just keep an eye on my time here. I think we're a bit over time. Shall we have one more question? Yeah.
Mark, you spoke about the Islamification of culture and the progression of that Islamic culture. In your understanding, is that why a lot of churches, Christian communities
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, why is it the case that Middle Eastern churches can be anti-Semitic or anti-Israel and so on? So, for example, the Coptic Pope has banned Coptic Christians from going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And he said he's done this in solidarity with the Palestinians and with Muslims. So he has a very difficult job because he has to keep Christians safe, and they're being abducted and raped and killed from time to time, and it's a difficult environment. So the Dhimma says, we will let you live as Christians and worship as Christians, provided you keep your heads down, are humiliated, and kept inferior. And one of the things you're not allowed to do is help Muslims become Christians. That's a breach of your Dhimma pact, and the consequence of that is war. The jihad restarts. So the churches that have survived under Islam have entered into a covenant that by their ancestors reaffirmed over generations that they would not help people come to Christ. And so if you're, say, a convert to Christianity in Egypt, if you went to a church on the street corner to find a Christian, they might turn you away. They might say, we're not going to help you. They might rationalize and say you can't trust people, they'll give reasons, but a fundamental reason is that they are in a spiritual bondage to not help believers because they've agreed to that 1,000 years ago. And that's been their heritage. So in Liberty to the Captives, I have prayers for renouncing that and helping them be set free. Why do Christians side against the Jews? Well, if you're under threat and you've watched millions of Christians be killed, Armenians, Syrian and Assyrians, in the last 100 years, and you've had a history of violence and pogroms and so on, and your daughters in Egypt are being kidnapped and forcibly converted and forced marriage to people. If you're living in a precarious situation, it's easier to hate the Jews in order to be in solidarity with the real threat that you face, which is from Islam. So, for example, Christians in the West Bank are not protected by the Palestinian Authority. They're vulnerable and they're often in a very difficult situation. But if they were to criticize their Muslim masters, their situation would be much worse. But if you criticize Israel, that you're in solidarity with Muslims. And in fact, Arabic-speaking Jews often emphasize their Arab identity. And they, in fact, initiated in the 19th century the Arab movement, which said we're going to create a new Arab identity, not a religious identity. And so Christians were able to think we don't have to be thought of as inferior Christians, we can just be Arabs with all the Muslims. So what you see is that the Christian Arabs will emphasize that Arab identity, they'll emphasize solidarity with the Muslims, they'll deny that Islam is the problem, they won't accept any discussion saying that they're under threat from Islam, and if you criticize the Israelis, the consequences for you will be much better than if you criticize the Muslims that are dominating your life. In the meantime, in country after country, Christians have been fleeing the Middle East. So, yeah, it's a deep psychological trap that they're caught in, and it's very difficult for them. You should have compassion for them. It's a very difficult situation, but that is one of the factors. So I write about this in my response to Kairos 2, which is a document that Christians have written to mobilize the Christian world to really try and dismantle Israel. But what they don't understand is the outcome of that. With 1% Christians amongst the Palestinians still in the Palestinian territories, the result of that will be the Dhimma. They will be subjugated very badly in an Islamic polity. And it got worse for them when the Palestinian Authority took over security in West Bank, and when Hamas took power in Gaza, it got worse for Christians, and it will get even worse if Israel disappeared. Israel's the only country in the Middle East where the number of Christians is growing. I'm going to stop there, and we've got afternoon tea, but it's a short break. I think it's just 10 minutes. So 20 past, we'll be back.